I I can't believe it. I honestly cannot believe what I just watched. Probably the best playoff game. I'm not a neutral fan in any of this, but I suspect as a neutral fan, you could probably call this the best playoff game in a long time. I'm trying to think of ones that may have come close to this. I know Game 5, what was it, 2016 or 2017, Ducks down 3-0 to the Oilers in the last 3 or so minutes of the third period. They come back to tie that and win in overtime. There was that game Boston-Toronto back in, I think, 2013 when the Bruins trailed 4-1 with about 10 minutes to go in the third period, come back in that one, tie it up, win in overtime. That was Game 7 in the first round. There was a game that even involved the Sharks down 4-0 to the Kings early in the second period, Game 3 of a first-round matchup against them back in 2011. The Sharks scored 5 goals in the second period, end up going into overtime tied at 5, and they win. But considering the circumstances, considering the fact this was an intense series, two massive rivals, this was a Game 7, this was a series in which the Sharks were down 3-1 after Game 4, just everything taken into account, what led to the comeback and everything taken into account, this has to be definitely the game of the playoffs thus far, and probably one of the best games that anyone has ever seen in a long time. And it didn't start off that way. Honestly, coming into this review, but by maybe 5 minutes into the third period, I was already formulating what I might say coming into this review. And I really had summed up to the point that everything that could go wrong for the Sharks in this game did, and everything that could go right didn't. That's really what it felt like, because the Sharks weren't actually playing that bad of a game. They were getting some decent opportunities onto Fleury. He was making some great saves, and when he was unable to do that, the Sharks just were getting zero bounces. And it was a bit of retribution, I guess, from what happened in the previous game where the Golden Knights were getting a ton of chances and Jones was making great saves, but also the Golden Knights weren't really getting too many bounces going their way there. So I thought it was sort of the other side of that, because especially when you look at the Golden Knights' goals, it was a pretty lucky one that led to Karlsson. The refs basically gifted Cody Eakin's goal as that one, at least to me and to many, it seemed as though many fans, or almost every fan that wasn't a Golden Knights fan, journalists, analysts, the commentators, seemed to all believe that this was a high stick, and yet the referees decide to call it a good goal. And then Pacioretty on a pretty bad one by Martin Jones early in the third period. I really thought that the Sharks could just drop that one, because they really were having such bad luck during the majority of this game. But then came that play, that huge momentum swing play. Cody Eakin cross-checks Joe Pavelski, and then Paul Stastny sort of pushes him further down into the ground, at which point Pavelski's unable to brace for his fall on the ice, and he smacks his head on the ice, and there's like a pool of blood that forms under there. He's not moving. This was probably one of the scariest injuries I've seen, at least for the Sharks. You know, when it comes to some other injuries like Thornton's knee injuries and Shemek's leg injuries, those are ones you see and you cringe a bit and you're like, wow, that gotta hurt. They're probably not going to play for another few months, but you're not really worried. You're mostly just sad that they're not going to be able to be in the lineup for a few months. But this Pavelski one was very worrying. It was very scary. It seemed to be at least relatively okay with the fact that he didn't need to be stretchered off the ice. He was able to skate with some help off the ice. So at least we know it's not completely horrible. But it definitely is still worrying. I would not be surprised at all if Joe Pavelski doesn't get another game for these playoffs. And I'm basically just hoping at this point that he can at least, lace up the skates at least at some other point. Maybe that's a bit pessimistic that I'm going that far, but it really looked quite bad for Joe Pavelski. And it ends up being called a 5-minute major. And honestly, if this would have been the shoe was on the other foot and this was like a Golden Knights player, let's say, I guess Derek Engelland would be a comparison because he's sort of the captain of that team, although he's not technically. Maybe a better comparison would be like William Karlsson because of equal skill, I guess you could say. If William Karlsson had gone down to a cross-check from like Sorensen, and then was pushed down further to the ice by Hurdle or something like that, and then the Sharks were assessed a 5-minute major for that, I probably would have been very upset because this, the penalty itself, the play itself wasn't, let's say, extremely dangerous that you normally see 5-minute majors come from, right? They're normally from, terrible hits from behind that are dangerous, hits to the head that are extremely dangerous. This it wasn't necessarily so dangerous. It was just a series of unfortunate events that occur that makes it so Pavelski ends up hitting his head on the ice. It was quite unfortunate for Joe Pavelski. So I don't necessarily agree with the 5-minute major. I was watching it on Sportsnet, so they had the panel talking about it. Elliot Friedman brought up the point that he'd like to see 5-minute majors to be able to be reviewed in the playoffs or just in general. I'm not sure if I agree with that, but I did agree somewhat with his point that maybe that shouldn't have been called 5 minutes. However, Ron McLean did bring up a really good point that this was like a 3-0 game for the Golden Knights. This was seeming to be somewhat of a blowout as the Sharks had sort of lost a lot of gas once Pacioretty got that goal and didn't seem like they were getting much rolling. And with how aggressive this series had been between the coaches and, Kane and Reeves and everything like that, if you're the referee and you don't end up calling, let's say, a 5-minute major on that penalty, this series, or at least the last few minutes of this game, could get really rough, and you probably don't want to see that. So I'm assuming the referee probably just wanted to control the pace of this game. You call the penalty, especially just considering that Joe Pavelski's injury was really bad in this scenario, and I could definitely see that in the moment when you see that happen, you're probably going to want to call 5 minutes anyway. So I don't blame the referee all too much, but I definitely know that if the shoe was on the other foot and this happened to the Sharks were called for a 5-minute major in this situation, I probably would have been extremely pissed. So I do feel for Golden Knights fans in that regard. What I don't feel for them in that regard is the fact that the Sharks then managed to score 4 goals on that major penalty. You can't blame the referees for when you give up 4 goals on the major power play, and it just feels as though that the Sharks really rallied around this. I mean, this was a team that they were getting great looks early on, but that just couldn't bury it, and it seemed once they fell behind 3-0, a lot of that excitement fell out, and they maybe just allowed themselves to then just play out these last few minutes and maybe take the loss in this Game 7. But their captain goes down, a player who has worked so hard to get to the position he is in the league right now, a 7th round pick. He was drafted at age 19, so a year after what his actual draft year was, if I'm not mistaken. He's had to work himself up into the NHL. He had no expectations. He had no help with him. He wasn't a highly touted prospect, but he's gone on to have 40-goal seasons. He's been a fantastic player for the San Jose Sharks. He's a heart and soul kind of guy. He lays it down on the ice. He's not the fastest skater. He's not the flashiest player, certainly, but he's worked so hard in the areas that he can improve in, like the tipping of the pucks and everything like that. And I'm sure so many Sharks players look up to a player like Joe Pavelski and his work ethic. And so it seemed as though that the Sharks rallied around that. With just 6 seconds into the major power play, Logan Couture buries the first one, and then Tomas Hertl adds to it. Couture adds again. LeBanc, who had 3 assists on those first 3 goals, makes it 4-3, and the Sharks have a lead, and this was the first time this series in which there was even a lead change at all, besides from 0-0. So it was a huge power play, a huge momentum swing, and yet what made this one of the best games in a long time, at least for neutral fans, was that in the last minute, Jonathan Marchessault, in what you would never expect this. You'd think all the momentum was with the San Jose Sharks. They were really trying to lay it down on the line to kill off these last few minutes. But Jonathan Marchessault manages to tie this game. And if you're a Sharks fan, you definitely dislike that. But if you're a neutral fan, I'm sure you're jumping out of your seat that this game is going to get in overtime. And in overtime, it does get. The Sharks getting some great chances. The Golden Knights getting some solid chances of their own. But eventually, the most unlikely of heroes, the player who scored the game winner in Game 5, he took the penalty that led to the shorthanded goal. That's not necessarily a positive, but it is sort of a weird coincidence. And then on just his second shift of the overtime, because the Sharks were rolling 9 players for the start of this, they decided to go with, since Pavelski was gone, they moved Nyquist up to the first line, and they had Melker Karlsson playing with Kane and Hertl, and they were just running the top 3 lines. Radill was god-awful for the, couple minutes that he actually got in this game, just completely horrible. Goodrow pretty bad himself, honestly enough, but eventually, your 15 minutes in the overtime, players are tired, the defense, dead tired, and so Goodrow comes on the ice. He has a pretty solid first shift, and then his second shift, he pulls this off, a move you would never expect Barclay Goodrow to be able to do, but he pulls it off on Fleury, who besides on that 5-minute major had been almost impenetrable there at even strength. but he pulls it off. His second goal of these playoffs, his second playoff goal of his career, and the Sharks win it in 7. And I don't have any talking points to even talk about, but I guess I'll mention a few things. I really didn't expect Barclay Goodrow to be the guy who would score this game winner. Honestly, I was mostly expecting someone like Hurdle, who did it last game. Kane had been playing pretty solidly in that overtime. Nyquist was actually playing really well in the overtime as well. Timo Meier had got him multiple chances in not just the overtime, but through the entire game, but somehow couldn't find his way to get past Marc-Andre Fleury. Labanc had been playing very, very well. He had a very good first period, just couldn't get one past Fleury. And then, of course, he had 4 points on that major power play. And so Goodrow scoring there was a huge surprise. Brennan Dillon didn't get any ice time there, or didn't get much ice time at all in the overtime, and it was Joachim Ryan, who was actually quite solid in the overtime, which was nice to see, getting some actual shifts, which was quite surprising. I don't know if Dillon was injured or something like that, although I doubt that. Maybe De Boer just didn't like Dillon's game that night. I'm not 100% sure, but Ryan looked pretty good. And one thing I do want to mention also, Brent Burns. So Burns is up for the Norris, and I've seen already many sentiments, as there usually is when anyone brings up Brent Burns, that, oh, he's terrible defensively, how could he ever be up for the Norris, blah, blah, he shouldn't even be in the top 5 or anything like that. I'm sure there's going to be some sports writers who are so like, I'm a fantastic defensive scout, and I realize Brent Burns is the worst defenseman in the league defensively, he's not even in my top 5. I'm sure there's going to be some people like that, even though Burns definitely deserves to be top 3, and I'm not going to argue here that he deserves to win the Norris, and I'm not going to argue here that he's the best defensive defenseman in the NHL. Of course not. He has a tendency of puck watching. He'll sometimes lose coverage in his own zone. He's very easy to pressure into making bad plays and bad passes and everything like that. But I must say that he is, I guess in my opinion, the best defenseman in the league when it comes to stick checks. He's absolutely fantastic when it comes to stick checks. He's able to get his stick into passing lanes so well. He's able to poke it off of players' sticks so well. And we saw this in the overtime, I think 2 or 3 times. Just Brent Burns making heroic plays. And you have to point to the fact that Brent Burns, maybe he wasn't great offensively in this series, but he played over 40 minutes last night. He played close to 40 minutes tonight. Brent Burns, such a workhorse for this team. And again, I say he's not the best defensive defenseman, but he really lays it out on the ice when you need him to. Brent Burns works very, very hard, and I'm very happy to have him on the Sharks. I mean, those stick checks were miraculous, game-winning plays, honestly enough. Yes, Goodrow was the one who scored the goals, but who knows what would happen if Brent Burns can't make some of those defensive plays happen. Same with Vlasic, who, of course, in games that he has finished in this series, he ended up going 4-0. He did not play in Game 3 and 4, in which the Sharks lost, and he did not finish Game 2. Who knows what would have happened there if Vlasic did manage to finish that game. So Vlasic, clearly a very key part of the Sharks' defense as well. And I'll also talk about Martin Jones, of course. He was actually quite good, even though he did let in the 4 goals. He had no chance on the Carlson or Eakin one. The Pacioretty one wasn't great. He didn't have much of a chance on the Marchessault one, but he definitely kept the Sharks alive in this game, at least somewhat. He made multiple miraculous breakaway saves on players early in the third, I believe, late in the second period. He had some great saves, and, if Marchessault hadn't been able to tie this one up, this may have been an even bigger point to point to, but his glove save onto Mark Stone with about 2 or 3 minutes to go in the third period, I don't think I've ever seen Martin Jones make a glove save like that. What a fantastic save by Martin Jones. And again, it was somewhat for naught because Marchessault tied that game, even though the Sharks did end up winning the game itself. But it was a beautiful glove save. I don't think I've ever seen Jones make that amazing of a glove save, and especially on a shooter like Mark Stone, who was leading the playoffs up to that point in goals. It was a huge play by Jones. He recovered in this series so well that it was very impressive that he was able to come out in Game 5, never mind Game 7, and actually play his heart out and allow the Sharks to be able to come back in this series. Now, I won't say too much else about the rest of the series. I will probably have a series review up before the Friday game, I guess before Saturday, when I'll have a review up for that Friday game against the Colorado Avalanche, as that will do it for this review. I will. I do have exams, so I don't know when it will be up, but I will discuss the series as a whole. This was mostly just for a game itself, but what a game it was! What a series it was! This absolutely insane. I'm sure if you're a neutral fan, this was probably one of the best series of the playoffs, one of the best series in a long time. If you're a Sharks fan, I'm sure you might need some heart repairs after the heart attacks and everything that was given here to the Sharks. Because while Game 5 was pretty nerve wracking, Game 6 and 7 both elimination games for the Sharks, both overtime games. Game 6 went into double overtime, and somehow the Sharks come out the other side with the victory. So they'll host the Colorado Avalanche Game 1 on Friday. The Avalanche did knock off the Calgary Flames in 5 games, so certainly not to be taken lightly. But it seems as though there's a ton of momentum here for the San Jose Sharks. I guess we'll see what ends up happening. But right now, it's basically a celebration here for the next couple of days before they get back to work and before we get back into the spirit of the playoffs on Friday. Class dismissed.